All right, so are you ready to dive into this? We're taking a deep dive into conversational hypnosis today. And I think this will be really interesting for our listeners. We've got some fascinating excerpts that you all have sent in from Virginie Imer's book, Advanced Conversational Hypnosis. And we're going to kind of unpack that together today and figure out what makes this approach so unique.
You know, what's really interesting about this is that conversational hypnosis is very different from what most people think of when they hear hypnosis.
Yeah.
It's not about, swinging pendulums and putting people into a sleep-like trance.
Yeah.
It's much more about using the power of conversation to tap into the subconscious.
So it's kind of like using those subtle cues, those spontaneous little unconscious moments that happen in a normal conversation. It's almost as if conversational hypnosis is like a way to decode those hidden
It
messages.
really is. Imir actually refers to those moments as windows into the subconscious.
Yeah.
And she says that these moments reveal what's really driving our thoughts and behaviors. Think about it. How often do we say things without even fully understanding why we said them?
Well, all the time. I mean, we've all had those slip of the tongue moments. So how does conversational hypnosis actually work then?
Well, one of the most important things is that you have to identify and address the real problem. Because very often the real problem is actually hidden beneath the surface. It's kind of like an iceberg. You only see the tip, but there's so much more going on underneath.
Right. So it sounds like that's very different from traditional therapy
hmm
because traditional therapy often just focuses on the symptoms, right? So do you have an example of that?
Yeah, actually, Imir discusses this case in the book where a client came to her struggling with procrastination. And at first glance, it seemed like a simple time management issue. But as they went through the hypnotic interview, a much deeper fear emerged. It turned out that the client was actually afraid of judgment, afraid of being seen.
Wow. So the procrastination was really just a symptom of a much deeper rooted issue. That's a really powerful way of showing how to uncover the real problem. So this hypnotic interview, though, that sounds like it's a lot more than just asking questions.
Well, absolutely. It involves, really actively listening and observing nonverbal cues, paying very, very close attention to those unconscious moments that Imir talks about. It's about reading between the lines, basically.
Okay, so what might these unconscious moments look like in an actual session? Are we talking about sudden outbursts or something more subtle than that?
Most of the time, they're actually very subtle. It could be a change in someone's tone of voice or a shift in body language. They might use a metaphor. All of these things can be unconscious moments that actually tell us what's going on in the subconscious.
Do you have some examples from the book?
Yeah, so in one case, a client was repeatedly using this phrase, hitting a wall, and they were talking about their career goals. And that metaphor was a huge clue to how they were feeling subconsciously.
Hmm.
They felt blocked, they felt stuck. And then in another case, there was a client who kept saying, I don't want to be seen. And this came up when they were talking about their creative aspirations,
Mm-hmm.
which suggests a deeper fear of exposure and judgment.
Wow, these examples are really bringing it to life. So how does a therapist actually use these unconscious moments to help someone then?
That's where ratification comes in. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about ratification.
So ratification is almost like a bridge between the conscious and subconscious mind. It's not about, offering solutions or interpreting what the client is saying. It's simply acknowledging and reflecting those unconscious expressions back to the client.
So for instance, if a client says, I feel trapped,
The therapist would simply say, you feel trapped. And it might seem a little too simple, but this mirroring actually has a really powerful effect. Because by hearing their own words reflected back to them, the client's awareness deepens, and the subconscious mind really starts to pay attention.
it sounds almost like a validation of those hidden feelings. And am I right that repetition also plays a key role in all of this?
Absolutely. Repeating those key phrases or metaphors back to the client, that actually helps to anchor them in their experience.
Yeah.
And it allows the subconscious mind to process and integrate those feelings.
So in the case of the client who is saying they didn't want to be seen, the therapist might repeat phrases back to them like,
Exactly. Something like not wanting to be seen or the need to feel safe. This repetition acts almost like a gentle spotlight. It illuminates those subconscious patterns without actually interrupting the natural flow of the client's inner world.
this is so fascinating. It's almost as if the therapist is helping the client to become more aware of the subtle language of their own subconscious.
Exactly. And you know what else is really fascinating about this whole process?
What's
The
that?
power of silence.
Silence. Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Silence allows the client's unconscious mind to really process information without any interference. Imir actually admits in the book that she would often catch herself interrupting a client's trance state just by asking too many questions. Sometimes the best thing a therapist can do is simply hold space and let the silence do its work.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
It's amazing how much we can learn by just paying attention to those silences in a conversation. But it sounds like these unconscious moments aren't just, random occurrences. They can actually lead to something much deeper, something that Imir refers to as a trance state.
that's right. In conversational hypnosis, we're not just observing these moments. We're actually trying to gently guide the client deeper into their subconscious experience.
So how does that actually happen? Does the therapist use like specific words or something to induce a trance?
Not really in the way that you might be picturing it. It's less about inducing and more about amplifying what's already there.
Right.
Remember how we talked about ratification, where the therapist mirrors the client's language? That's actually a key technique for deepening the experience.
So by simply reflecting those unconscious expressions back to the client, the therapist is actually helping them enter a trance state.
Exactly. And as the client's attention becomes more and more focused on their inner world, a natural shift occurs, and they enter a state of heightened internal focus. But this is very different from, those dramatic sleep-like trances that we see in movies.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's not like the client is suddenly under a spell or something, right?
And at all. They're fully aware of their surroundings, but their internal experience changes. It's almost like being totally absorbed in a daydream or getting lost in a book. You're still conscious, but your attention is totally focused inward.
That's a great analogy. So what's actually happening inside the client's mind during this trance state then? Are they like reliving past traumas or having sudden epiphanies?
Well, it's not always that dramatic. The beauty of conversational hypnosis is that we don't have to totally understand the subconscious in order to create change. The client's own inner wisdom takes over in that space.
So it's more about creating the right conditions for the client's subconscious to do its work. The therapist isn't providing solutions, but they're guiding the process.
Exactly. That's the key difference. Imir really stresses how important it is to not interrupt this delicate process, by adding in elaborate metaphors or suggestions. The therapist's role is really just to be a guide, a facilitator, to observe, to ratify, and to trust in the client's own innate ability to heal.
It sounds almost like a form of deep listening, allowing space for the client's subconscious to just unfold and reveal its own solutions.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. And remember, silence is essential here. Allowing for those pauses, those moments of quiet reflection, that gives the client's subconscious the space it needs to kind of breathe and process everything.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most profound changes happen in stillness, not in all the hustle and bustle. But when a client comes out of this trance state, what kinds of changes do they actually experience?
Well, it varies, of course, but often they come out of it with new perspectives, a deeper understanding of themselves, and sometimes even spontaneous shifts in their behavior. They might not even fully grasp why they feel different,
Hmm.
but something has definitely shifted within them.
That's incredible. So it's not about the therapist fixing the client. It's more about guiding them on a journey of self-discovery.
Precisely. And the really amazing thing is that this potential for transformation goes way beyond the therapy room.
Oh, so?
Well, we've been talking about the therapeutic context, but the principles of conversational hypnosis can be applied to our everyday interactions too. Imagine what could happen if we all started paying closer attention to those little subtle cues in our conversations, with our loved ones, our colleagues, even strangers.
That's a really interesting point. It's like we all have the potential to become more attuned to those deeper layers of communication, to listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts and minds.
Beautifully said. And who knows what kind of insights and connections we might find along the way.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of conceptual ground here, but I'm sure our listeners are also curious about the practical side of things. So what are some specific techniques that are actually used in conversational hypnosis?
That's a great question. Let's take a look at some practical examples of how therapists use language and questioning to create those transformative trance states.
Awesome. Let's do it.
All right.
Okay, so let's get into like the nitty-gritty. We've talked about these unconscious moments and trance states and stuff. But what does the actual like language of conversational hypnosis sound like? How does a therapist use words to actually guide this whole process?
It's really fascinating because it's almost like an art form. The therapist really has to be very skillful with language. They've got to use it in a way that sort of bypasses the conscious mind and speaks directly to the subconscious. Imir compares it to a delicate dance. It's all about balancing precision with flexibility.
So is there like no script? Like each session is totally unique?
Exactly. There are, of course, some, principles and techniques, but each conversation kind of unfolds organically. The therapist needs to be super attuned to the client's responses, both verbal and nonverbal, constantly adjusting their approach as they go.
Right, that makes sense. So can you give me some examples of these language patterns?
Sure. So one technique is called embedded commands. These are basically subtle suggestions that are woven into the conversation, almost like planting little seeds in the subconscious.
Okay, so like what would that sound like?
Okay, imagine a therapist saying something like, as you breathe deeply, you might start to notice a sense of calm washing over you. So the embedded command there is breathe deeply, and it's delivered in a way that's not likely to trigger any resistance from the conscious mind.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like slipping past the gatekeeper. I'm starting to see how powerful language can be in this context. What other techniques are used?
Another really interesting one is the use of presuppositions. These are statements that assume something is true, even though it hasn't actually been explicitly stated.
I don't know if I'm following. Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so a therapist might ask something like, how much lighter will you feel when you let go of this burden?
Hmm.
So that question actually presupposes that the client will eventually release the burden, which can then subtly shift their subconscious beliefs.
Ah, I see. So it's like gently nudging the client towards a more positive outcome
Yeah,
without, directly challenging their current perspective.
exactly. And then, of course, there's the power of metaphors and stories, which can be super effective for bypassing those conscious defenses.
Yeah, we all love a good story.
Yeah.
So how does that work in conversational hypnosis?
Well, our subconscious minds are just naturally drawn to narratives, and metaphors allow us to access, deeper meanings and emotional experiences without triggering resistance. So instead of directly challenging a client's belief, a therapist might use a metaphor to illustrate a totally different perspective.
Do you have an example of that?
Sure, let's say you have a client who's really struggling with self-criticism. The therapist might share a story about a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly, highlighting the beauty that can emerge from a period of struggle. So the metaphor kind of bypasses those conscious defenses, and it allows the subconscious mind to absorb that underlying message of transformation.
Yeah, it's such a powerful image. It really does highlight the transformative potential of this whole approach.
It does, doesn't it? And that's really the essence of conversational hypnosis, using language in a way that speaks to the deepest parts of ourselves, unlocking hidden potential and helping to create profound personal change.
This has been an incredible deep dive. It's amazing to think that we all have this power within us, and that something as simple as a conversation can unlock so much transformation.
It really shows the incredible power of the human mind to heal and grow.
Yeah, and maybe the biggest takeaway for our listeners is that we don't need to be trained therapists to benefit from these principles. If we just start paying closer attention to the nuances of communication, we can all become more attuned to those unconscious moments, both in ourselves and in others.
Absolutely. There's always more to discover beneath the surface.
So to all of our listeners out there, I really encourage you to embrace curiosity, to really truly listen with your whole being, and to explore those hidden depths within. Who knows what wonders you might uncover?
Every conversation has the potential to be a transformative experience.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive into conversational hypnosis. Thanks for layering us on this fascinating journey.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. We've talked about these unconscious moments and trance states, but what does the actual language of conversational hypnosis sound like? How does a therapist use words to guide this process?
Well, it's really fascinating because it's almost like an art form. The therapist has to be so skillful with language. They use it in a way that kind of bypasses the conscious mind and speaks right to the subconscious. Eimir compares it to like a delicate dance, balancing precision and flexibility.
So there's no set script or anything. Each session is totally unique.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, there are principles and techniques, of course, but every conversation is going to unfold differently. The therapist has to be really attuned to the client's responses,
Yeah.
Both verbal and nonverbal.
Yeah.
And they're constantly adjusting their approach as they go.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give me some examples of what these language patterns might look like?
Sure. So one technique that's often used is called embedded commands. These are basically subtle suggestions that are kind of woven into the conversation, almost like planting seeds in the subconscious.
Oh, okay, I see. Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so imagine a therapist saying something like, as you breathe deeply, you might begin to notice a sense of calm washing over you. So the embedded command there is breathe deeply. and it's delivered in a way that's not likely to trigger any resistance from the conscious mind.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like slipping past the gatekeepers almost. I'm starting to really see how powerful language can be in this context. What other techniques are used?
Another fascinating one is using presuppositions. So these are statements that assume something is true, even if it hasn't been explicitly stated.
I'm not sure I'm following.
Okay, so for example, a therapist might ask something like, how much lighter will you feel when you let go of this burden?
Hmm.
Now, that question actually presupposes that the client will eventually release the burden, which can then subtly shift their subconscious beliefs.
I see. So it's like kind of nudging the client towards a more positive outcome
Yeah.
without directly, challenging their current perspective.
Exactly. And then there's also the power of metaphors and stories, which can be incredibly effective for bypassing those conscious defenses.
Right, because we all love a good story. So how does that work in conversational hypnosis?
Well, our subconscious minds are naturally drawn to narratives. Metaphors allow us to access those deeper meanings and emotional experiences without triggering that resistance. So instead of directly challenging a client's belief, a therapist might use a metaphor to illustrate a totally different perspective.
Okay, do you have like a specific example of that?
Sure. Let's say you have a client who's really struggling with self-criticism. The therapist might share a story about a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly, highlighting the beauty that can emerge from a period of struggle. And that metaphor can kind of bypass those conscious defenses. It allows the subconscious mind to really absorb that message of transformation.
That's such a powerful image. It really highlights the transformative potential of this approach.
It does, doesn't it? And that's really the essence of conversational hypnosis, using language in a way that speaks to the deepest parts of ourselves, unlocking that hidden potential and creating profound personal change.
Wow, this has been such an incredible deep dive. It's amazing to think that we all have this power within us, and that something as simple as a conversation can unlock so much transformation.
It really speaks to the incredible capacity of the human mind, you know, that capacity for healing and growth.
And I think the biggest takeaway for our listeners today is that we don't have to be trained therapists to benefit from these principles. If we just start paying closer attention to those little nuances in communication, we can all become so much more attuned to those unconscious moments, both in ourselves and in the people around us.
Exactly. There's always more to discover if we just look beneath the surface.
So, to all of our listeners out there, I encourage you to stay curious, to truly listen with your whole being, and to explore those hidden depths within yourselves. Who knows what you might find?
Every conversation has the potential to be a transformative experience.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the incredible world of conversational hypnosis. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.